It is now my privilege to welcome to the podium United States Senator Barack Obama.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Well, to Chancellor Collins, to the Board of Trustees, to the faculty, parents, family, friends, to Catherine Reyes, who stole the show, and to the outstanding class of 2006. Congratulations on your graduation. Thank you so much for the great honor of allowing me to be part of it. You know, it is always good to be back in Boston. As some of you may have heard, I was here a few years ago giving a little speech at the 2004 Democratic Convention, and it was an amazing experience, a humbling honor, a tremendous opportunity. And if you had come to me and said a few years earlier that I would be delivering that speech, I would have politely told you that you were out of your mind. Because you need to hear the story of the previous Democratic Convention and my experience there. It was the year 2000. I had just had my head handed to me in my very first race for Congress. Didn't even make it past the primary. I got beat badly. I was a little depressed. I was a little broke. My wife was mad at me. So some of my friends suggested, in the spirit, I guess, of getting back on the horse once you've fallen off, that I should go and attend the Democratic Convention that was taking place in Los Angeles that year. And so I decided to go. And when my plane landed in LA, at LAX, I gathered up my luggage. I walked over to the Hertz counter, filled out the forms to rent a car, gave my credit card. Woman comes back a little bit later, says, excuse me, Mr. Obama, your card's been rejected. And so I said, well, I've got another one. And I handed her my American Express card. And she said, that's not working either. So I had to get on the phone with American Express and beg them to let me rent this car. I finally made it to the convention, only to learn that I had been thought of so highly by the Democratic Party that my credentials granted me access to every restroom in the Staples Center. But beyond that, I couldn't go anywhere else. And so, being the VIP that I was, I spent the rest of the week as the guy in the room who nobody knew, but everybody knew didn't really belong there. Needless to say that when they asked me to be the convention keynote speaker just 4 years later, I only had one requirement. They had to get me a car. Now, receiving that honor obviously was a welcome change, and as MasterCard can attest, it was a little bit unlikely. But of course, America is an unlikely place. It's a country built on defiance of the odds, on a belief in the impossible. And as I remind you of this, because as you set off on your own lives of success and achievement, it's now your turn to help keep it this way. It's your turn to keep this daringly radical but unfailingly simple notion of America alive. That no matter where you're born or how much your parents have, no matter what you look like or what you believe in, you can still rise to become whatever you want. Still go on to achieve great things. still pursue the happiness that you hope for. Today, this dream sounds common. It's even become a cliche. Yet for most of human history, it's been anything but. As a servant in Rome, a peasant in China, or a subject of King George, there were very few unlikely futures. No matter how hard you worked or struggled for something better, you knew you'd spend your life forced to build somebody else's empire, to sacrifice for somebody else's cause. But as the centuries passed, the people of the world grew restless. They were tired of tyranny and weary of their lot in life. And as they saw merchants start to sail across oceans and explorers set off in search of new worlds, they followed. And it was right here, right in these waters, where the American experiment began. As the earliest settlers arrived on the shores of Boston and Salem and Plymouth, they dreamed of building a city on a hill. And the world watched, waiting to see if this improbable idea called America would succeed. For over 200 years, it has. Not because our dream has progressed perfectly, it hasn't. It's been scarred by our treatment of native peoples, betrayed by slavery and Jim Crow, clouded by the subjugation of women, shaken by war and depression. Yet the true test of our union is not whether it's perfect, it's whether we work to perfect it. Whether we recognize our failings, identify our shortcomings, and then rise to meet the challenges of our time. And so we've broadened the American family by winning civil rights and voting rights for women and then African Americans, by choosing to welcome waves of new immigrants to our shores. We've pushed the boundaries of opportunity by providing free education for our children and health care for our seniors and our poor. And we've won bargaining rights and wage hikes and retirement security for our workers. None of this has happened on its own. Much of it seemed impossible at the time. But all of it came about because ordinary men and women were willing to engage in the hard work of doing extraordinary things, because they had faith that here in America, our imperfect dream could be perfected. Now, there may be some who doubt that much has changed. Those who doubt that things are better today than they were yesterday. For those who believe that, take a look at this class of 2006. More than half representing the very first members of their family ever to attend college, in the most diverse university in New England. I look out at a sea of faces that are African American and Hispanic American and Asian American and Arab American and Anglo American. I see students who've come here from 100 different countries, believing, like those first settlers, that they too could find a home in that city on a hill. That they too could find success in the unlikeliest of places. All this has occurred in the midst of a city where no Irish need apply signs once hung from stores. All of this city in a place where just 30 years ago, buses of black students were pelted with rocks as they pulled into schools in South Boston, where the Red Sox were once the team who refused to sign the great Jackie Robinson. But the problem isn't that we haven't made progress. We have. The problem is that the progress still isn't good enough. There's more work to be done. More justice. There's more work to be done. There's more justice to be had. There are more barriers to break down, and now it's your generation's turn to bring those changes about. Now, the last century was undoubtedly the American century. Our victory over fascism and communism liberated millions. At home, we built a shared prosperity that created the largest middle class in history. Ours was a nation of liberators, of free people, of prosperous people, and the world took notice. But today, just a few years into the 21st century, we've already found ourselves in a different and sometimes precarious position. As revolutions in communications and technology have broken down barriers across the world, it's given more power to both our competitors and to our enemies. No longer can we assume that a high school education in Boston is enough to compete for a job that can easily go to the college-educated in Bangalore or in Beijing. No more can we count on employers to provide health care and pensions and job training when their bottom lines know no borders. Never again can we expect the oceans that surround America to keep us safe from attacks on our own soil. So what does this mean for you? What role will you play in meeting these challenges? I do not pretend to have all the answers. Each of you are going to have to discover those on your own. But perhaps I can offer a few suggestions that may be useful along the way, some of which have already been echoed in the remarks and comments of the previous speakers. The first, take risks, class of 2006. You know, when I was on the brink of graduating from college, I had this crazy idea that I wanted to be a community organizer and work in low-income neighborhoods. Now, my folks didn't even know there was such a thing as a community organizer. My mother and grandparents thought that I should go to law school. My friends, they were all busy applying for jobs on Wall Street. But I went ahead and I wrote, must have been 200 letters to every organization in the country that I thought was trying to do something good in their neighborhoods. And finally, there was this small group of churches on the south side of Chicago who wrote back and offered me a job helping them deal with the consequences of steel plants that had closed and put thousands out of work. And the churches didn't have a lot of money, so they offered me the grand sum of $12,000 a year plus a $1,000 car expense. And so I bought an old beat-up car for $800, and I packed up my belongings, and I got out a map, and I started driving west to Chicago, a place where I'd never been and where I didn't know a single living soul. And about halfway between New York City and Chicago, I stopped for the night at a small town in Pennsylvania, whose name I can't remember anymore. And I found a motel that looked cheap and clean, and I pulled into the driveway, and I went to the counter where there was this old guy doing crossword puzzles. And I asked him for a room. And as he was filling out the information, he looked up and he asked me where I was headed. And I explained to him I was going to Chicago because I was going to be a community organizer. And he asked me what was that. And I explained to him that I was going to be working in low-income neighborhoods, trying to set up job training programs and the like. And he said to me, you know, you look like a nice, clean-cut young man. You've got a nice voice, he said. So let me give you a piece of advice. Forget, what do you call this? Community organizing. Forget about this community organizing business. You cannot change the world, and people will not appreciate you trying. What you should do is go into television broadcasting. I am telling you, you can make a name for yourself there. Now, I could have taken my mother's advice. I could have taken my grandparents' advice. I could have followed the same path that my friends were traveling. I could have taken the words of wisdom from that old man in Pennsylvania. Objectively speaking, he made some sense. But I knew that there was something in me that wanted to try for something bigger. So don't let people talk you out of doing what you think is that bigger thing. Listen to what's in you. Listen to what's in you. Decide what you care so much about that you are willing to risk everything for it. My second piece of advice, and I know it's getting drizzly, and I've only got 3 pieces of advice. Second piece of advice is stay global. Think globally. As the world continues to change and we become more connected with each other, globalization is going to bring both benefits and disruptions to our lives. Either way, it's here. It's not going away. We can try to build walls around us. We can look inward only. We can respond by being frightened and angry about those disruptions. We can take it out on those folks who don't look like us, but that's not what we're about. We are a confident country, not a fearful country. We can meet these challenges. So every one of us needs to learn how to compete. It means we need an energy policy that will create new jobs in this country and then our dependence on foreign oil. It means that we need to update our social contract to make sure that people have health care and pensions and training no matter where they work or how many times they switch jobs. It means that we should welcome immigrants to our shores. Yes, those immigrants. And we should make sure that those immigrants have the opportunity to learn English because we are part of a common culture with a common language. But you know what? We should also be teaching our children to speak some Spanish and some Mandarin and some Patois because that's the world that they're going to be growing up in. Third piece of advice is cultivate a sense of empathy. Put yourself in other people's shoes. See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world, one that makes you understand what your obligations to others are, that they extend beyond the people who look like you and act like you and laugh at the same jokes as you do and live in the same neighborhoods. Now, I know that because especially on this campus, so many of you have been serving at homeless shelters and high schools and youth centers and job placement organizations all over the Boston area. I know that you understand this idea of empathy, and I hope that this spirit of service lives on long after you leave this institution. Because as you continue on in life, it's not always easy. In the years to come, you're going to encounter all kinds of people and all kinds of obstacles that stand in the way of empathy, that argue against empathy. You'll find people who, out of fear or the need for power, try to divide us and deny whatever is common in us. You'll hear that the Americans who sleep in the streets and beg for food got there because they're all lazy or weak in spirit, that the immigrants who risk their lives to cross deserts or oceans have nothing to contribute to this country and no desire to embrace our ideals. You'll hear that inner city children who are trapped in some of the nation's most dilapidated schools can't learn and won't learn, and so we should just give up on them. That the innocent people being slaughtered and expelled from their homes halfway around the world are somebody else's problem to take care of. You'll hear all this, and you'll have to choose. You'll have to decide where your obligations lie. And let me tell you, the easiest thing in the world is to do nothing. To turn off the TV, put down the paper, walk away from the stories about Iraq or Darfur or poverty or violence or joblessness or hopelessness. To go about your busy lives wishing these problems away. To remain detached. To remain indifferent, to remain safe. But I hope you do not do what is easy. I hope you do what is hard. Now, I often imagine young Americans, teenagers and college kids not much older than you, from all over the country watching the civil rights movement unfold before them on their television sets. I imagine that they would have seen the marchers and heard the speeches, but they also probably saw the dogs and the fire hoses, or the footage of innocent people being beaten within an inch of their lives. And maybe they would have heard the news that day that 4 little girls had been killed while they were going to Sunday school, when somebody threw a bomb at their church. And so these young people from all across the country, instinctively, they would have known that it was safer and it was smarter to stay at home and to watch the movement from afar. But somewhere in their hearts, they also understood that these people in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi were their brothers and sisters. That what was happening was wrong, and that they had an obligation to make it right. And so when the buses pulled up for a freedom ride down south, they got on those buses, and they rode, thousands of them, and they changed the world. And we're going to need you to do the same. Bobby Kennedy once told a crowd of South Africans no older than you, he said, "The world demands the qualities of youth." The world demands the qualities of youth. Not a time, but a state of mind, a temper of will, a quality of the imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the love of ease. That remains sound advice in this place we call America, a place where millions of restless adventurers from all over the world, including your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, still weary from their lot in life, still hoping for something better, have traveled great distances and taken great risks for a chance to arrive on our shores. You know, my father was one of them, born and raised in Kenya before that nation was freed from the shackles of colonialism. He grew up herding his father's goats, and from time to time, he attended local schools, but he wanted more. He dreamed of coming to America, even though he really didn't understand what America was. But he had this sense that he could further his education there and improve his skills and return to Kenya to help rebuild a newly independent country. Now, I didn't know my father very well. My father and mother separated when I was very young, but before I went to law school, I traveled back to Kenya to try to piece together his story and to meet my relatives there. And I went to this tiny village up north in Kenya on the shores of Lake Victoria called Alego. And in this village, my grandmother still lives. And it's the village where my father was buried, and my grandfather's was buried as well. And I asked my grandmother if there was anything left from my father that might provide me memories of him. And she opened a trunk, and she took out a stack full of letters. And there were more than 30 letters, all of them written by my father, all of them addressed to colleges and universities all across America. They were letters not so different from the letters that I had written 25 years later when I was trying to find a job that would give purpose to my life. And I read all these letters, which were in the simple, sometimes awkward, sometimes not grammatically correct voice of somebody desperate for a chance to come and live his unlikely dream. And it's because someone answered that dream that I stand before you today, hopeful for our collective futures, excited for your individual prospects, and eager for you to come and keep the legacy of this country alive for the years to come. You are going to be tested. You won't always succeed, but know that you have it in your power to try, and that these same generations who come before you face these same fears and uncertainties about the future, and that through our collective labor and through God's providence and our willingness to shoulder each other's burdens, America will continue on its journey toward that distant horizon and a better day. Thank you so much to the class of 2006. Congratulations on your graduation. Thank you, guys. Thank you.